Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be back with everyone. I'm in the process right in this moment of kind of copying over everything, moving it over to different groups, and getting everything in there where we need to be. It's so great to be back with you all. It's been a while. In fact, we had a very abrupt ending last fall, and that was totally on me. I'm at a little bit more liberty to share now what was going on at the time than I was, just a little while ago. So we were in the middle of doing the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Suddenly I said, I have to take a break. It's going to be about a month. And the short term answer, and I'd love to share the story with you personally, but I can't share it online, but ended up on jury duty for about 4.5 weeks. And so it took me off social media, took me off a lot of different things. And so because of that, I wasn't allowed to be on social media. And so I was kind of restricted in those ways, but so grateful to be back with you all. It really is wonderful to be back and doing these studies again. I always miss when I don't have opportunity to do these, and so it's truly great to be one on one again, even though it is online and it's not necessarily in person as much as I would like it to be. But I am not going to complain. I'm just going to be excited about this moment that we get to be back together. In the same way, I'm having my small technical difficulties along the way, specifically getting it connected over to YouTube. It's giving me some issues, it's asking for some new codes. And honestly, I just didn't really want to deal with it right in that moment because I was so excited about the lesson. I wanted to spend more time on that than getting all the rest of that together. If this is your first time, if this is the first time you're joining us, we've had a lot of new people that have joined the group. A lot of you have been inviting a ton of people. Some of you may have even gotten an invitation from me and the rest. This group has grown exponentially over the last little while. In fact, just as part of my slides, I'm just going to kick off and kind of look here. Obviously, a welcome to everyone, but the rabbit hole study and the way it started, and I feel I kind of need to do that because we have so many new people. It all started 3 years ago. A student asked me if I'd offer our weekly campus study online so that he could attend virtually, mainly because I was doing these studies on Tuesday nights on campus at Ohio State, but he was unable to be there because he was going to be off at school. And so I said, sure. So we started off that first week, and I had 5 people watching. And I'll be honest with you, super excited, 5 people. It was amazing. By the end of the semester, we had about 1,000 viewers a week, which I was not expecting, mainly because it was just kind of an online forum. And fast forward to today, in the group, as of right now, this is 2025 in the spring. We have about 1,300 members in the Rabbit Hole Study group, which you're welcome to come and join. There's unique things that I put in there that I don't place elsewhere. And so it's free and open for everyone to come and join. We have 1,300 members in that group and averaging around 4,000 to 5,000 viewers across all platforms now. That is every week. Which is amazing. You guys are amazing. The fact that you're tuning in so consistently, not just live, but also after the fact and watching and adding your comments. That's one of the things that I love about this type of study is I want your comments. I want your thoughts on these things. That's part of the process. One of the reasons I also kind of prepare for this is I love this material. This is the type of stuff I'm reading kind of on a daily basis as it is. But I also know that there's a lot of people who don't like being on camera. They don't like they don't want, they're kind of afraid of being in an online class where they're speaking or they're doing something. And so this kind of takes that off of you. You can write it out. You can take your time. You can add it after. You can go back. It's up to you. That's where you have the freedom. Now, let me also say, I love to know where you guys are coming in, tuning in from. Let me know where you're tuning in from, where everybody's coming. I'd love to know that at any point in time. So please let me know if you are tuning in from wherever you may be. I love knowing. I also say, I love to know where you guys are coming. It's fantastic to see all of the comments and the stuff that are kind of popping up already. In fact, I'm having to try to keep up with some of those things and see all the videos and all the stuff that people are commenting on already, which is really, really cool. So I hope you guys are just as excited as I am to be back in this place. Back in this, let me know where your moment. More than that, I hope you're ready for the study. I really am. Hope you're ready for this. So, obviously, now I have someone literally banging at the door, which is always fun at my house. And so, hopefully, my wife will go and take care of that here in a second. But let me start off by saying, who's Clive Staples Lewis, or Jack to his friends? Some of you may have never known that was actually his name. You just read C.S. Lewis. Never knew that his name was Clive Staples. Here's the fun part about it. he didn't really like his name either, so all of his friends just called him Jack. And I always just loved that little comment that he was known as Jack to his friends. So Clive Staples Lewis, more commonly known as Jack or C.S. Lewis, was a British writer, a scholar, and a Christian apologist. He is perhaps best known for his works of fiction, particularly the Chronicles of Narnia, as well as his contributions to Christian apologetics and literature. If you have a favorite book of his, please put it in there. I love that. Let me know which one's your favorite. There are 7 through the Chronicles of Narnia series, and there's others. So take a look and let me know which one's your favorite. So C.S. Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898, in Belfast, Ireland, which is now Northern Ireland. He was the second son of Albert James Lewis and Florence Augusta Hamilton Lewis, and his early childhood was marked by tragedy. His mother died when he was just 9 years old. And Lewis attended quite a few different schools, and honestly, he was always fairly bright, especially in reading and writing. Lewis studied at Malvern College and then served in World War I. After the war, he pursued higher education, attending University College, Oxford. Now, this is one of those interesting parts, especially about his attending Oxford. A lot of people don't realize that Oxford is a conglomeration of about, I think it's 40-something different colleges. Cambridge, I think, is 30-something. And so you have like Jesus College, University College. You have different colleges along the way, but they're all part of the larger university. And so think of it kind of like houses in Harry Potter. You all have the different houses that people are kind of put into, but they're all still part of Hogwarts. Same thing with Oxford and the rest. He eventually became a fellow and a tutor in English literature. Lewis's academic interests spanned literature, philosophy, and medieval studies, and specifically, he was a classic medieval literature professor. A lot of people assume that he was some form of Christian apologist, specifically in his writings. That's what he was doing, but that's actually not true. And most of his was in literature. He became a renowned scholar in these fields and was known for his very engaging teaching style. It's what he was most known for. Lewis was a prolific writer, a writer on a wide range of topics. Obviously, the Chronicles of Narnia. He also wrote science fiction. A lot of people don't realize that one, called the Space Trilogy. Allegorical works, The Great Divorce, and novels like Till We Have Faces. His nonfictions include Christian apologetics, Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, and a lot of philosophical essays, which, by the way, is where we'll get into God in the Dock. That is a lot of his philosophical essays that he writes, along with literary criticism. Probably my favorite, if I had to put one down, and maybe you can write in the chat what your favorite of his is, besides probably Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, the ones that deal with great Christian philosophical and theological aspects. I love the Screwtape Letters. It's one of my favorite. I did a study on the Screwtape Letters last spring. In fact, went through the whole thing. It's all available on YouTube. You can go and watch it, watch along. It's one of my favorites to read through because it's like a reverse study. And so I definitely encourage you all to go and check that one out if you get a chance. Now, Lewis was initially an atheist. I say initially, he grew up in a Christian household, but then became an atheist, but later underwent a significant spiritual journey that kind of led him to embrace Christianity. His conversion was influenced by his friendships with fellow scholars, such as, and a lot of people don't know this, J.R.R. Tolkien. So writer of Lord of the Rings and the rest. They were dear friends, along with different discussions with other Christian intellectuals. Lewis's Christian faith played a central role in his later writings along the way. I do need to note one specific thing, especially about his childhood, and I wrote out some separate notes for this, and so I don't have these on the slides, but hopefully they'll be of help to you. So Lewis's faith in particular, while he was born to his mother and the rest, and his father was a solicitor, which is basically a lawyer. His father was very emotionally distant from him, especially after the death of his mother. And he enjoyed kind of a vivid imagination, creating stories with his brother Warnie. In fact, my wife a few years back bought me a fantastic book, which is one that he and his brother had done the caricatures and designs for, of this wild little land of woods and the rest. And it's very playful and childlike, and it's from their childhood, and it's wonderful. Now, his descent into atheism specifically came about in 1908, and that's after his mother died. Her death kind of shattered his world, leaving him very cold, found himself kind of deal with an authoritarian father, and very much a sense of abandonment. So later on, he wrote a book called Surprised by Joy in 1955, which is kind of his spiritual autobiography, that this loss of his mom made God seem cruel and distant. And in a lot of ways, I guess we can kind of understand that. We can understand the premise of that. Sent to boarding schools in England, Lewis encountered kind of harsh conditions along the way and uninspiring religious instruction, further eroding his faith. Now, if I'll be honest with you, as a Bible teacher myself, I understand at times how even some of the things we teach can be hard. It's even worse when you do not have people who seem enthusiastic about it, or they treat it as a mere academic activity, the study of religion, the study of faith. And that can be eroding to faith at times. So by his early teens, he began to question Christianity, feeling its doctrines were either oppressive or illogical. And as an adolescent, Lewis kind of immersed himself in literature. Greek myths, Norse sagas, the works of romantic poets like Shelley and Keats. They fueled kind of his growing skepticism. And they offered him a worldview that seemed richer and freer than the Christianity he'd known, at least. So by age 15, under the influence of his rationalist tutor, a man by the name of William T. Kirkpatrick, who has, I believe it's a book called The Great Knock, and his own philosophical explorations on his own, Lewis kind of declared himself an atheist. He embraced a materialistic outlook, rejecting the supernatural as superstition and viewing the universe as a kind of a bleak, mechanistic, mechanical place. World War I did not help in this. World War I, in fact, reinforced this stance for him. And serving in the trenches in 1917 and 1918, he witnessed death and suffering firsthand in ways most of us can't imagine, including the loss of his dear friend, Patty Moore. He would go on to take care of his Patty Moore's mother later on in life. The war kind of cemented his belief that a benevolent God was kind of incompatible with the world of chaos and pain. And so for over a decade, really, Lewis lived kind of as a committed atheist. At Oxford, when he studied and later taught, he sharpened kind of that intellect through debates and immersed himself in a secular academic life. He saw Christianity as a myth, and he writes about that, no different from pagan tales, kind of beautiful, but not perhaps true. Now, Lewis's journey back to Christianity began kind of very subtly in the 1920s, driven by his love of literature and an unexpected encounters with joy, as he would put it, a fleeting, kind of piercing longing he couldn't explain in materialistic terms. In fact, that's why he writes later on, Surprised by Joy, that very premise. So works by Christian authors like George MacDonald, Fantastes. One of my favorite lines that he says of that, he read that book, and that was the book that baptized his imagination. And then he says, the rest of me took a little while longer. But he also read G.K. Chesterton, The Everlasting Man, which kind of unsettled his atheism, planting seeds of doubt within his atheistic worldview. These authors kind of suggested that the myths he loves might point to a deeper truth. Meanwhile, his friendship with devout Christians like J.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson kind of challenged this worldview that he had constructed. They argued that Christianity was what they called true myth, a story that fulfilled the human longing for meaning, was grounded in historical reality. And then by 1929, Lewis, I think he was 31 at the time, reached a breaking point, wrestling with the idea of kind of a purposeful universe. He reluctantly concluded that God must exist. In fact, one evening when he was at Magdalen College, Oxford, he, and this is a quote, he gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. He described himself as, and I quote, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England, accepting theism, but not yet Christianity. This was a rational step, recognizing kind of a purposeful intelligence behind design and existence, but not an emotional or doctrinal one. It wasn't a conversion in the way we would talk about it. It was an acceptance that there was a God. Where that led him to, he would find out soon after. In fact, the final leap came almost, I think, 2 years later, and it was kind of catalyzed by a pivotal conversation with Tolkien and Dyson on what he, quote, notes as September 19th, 1931. And walking along Addison's Walk at Oxford is one of my favorite places to take a walk. They discuss myth, truth, and Christ's story, the story of Jesus, the gospel. And Tolkien argued that Christianity was the fulfillment of all myths, with the incarnation as God entering history. This really, I think the exact words he used was kind of clicked. This clicked for Lewis. The resurrection wasn't just a tale, but a fact that made sense of everything else. And days later, on September 28th, while riding on Warney's motorcycle sidecar to the zoo, Warney was his older brother, and he was a avowed bachelor at this point in time. So Warney and him were riding to the zoo. So he was in the sidecar of the motorcycle. Lewis realized he believed in Jesus. And he wrote later on, "When I set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and when I reached the zoo, I did." And I always loved that because it was kind of this weird motion. He's like, I got in the sidecar and I thought my whole way into the zoo, and by the time I got there, I realized that Jesus was who he said he was. So this conversion wasn't dramatic, but kind of quiet and intellectual. It was rooted in reason, but also in an imagination. Lewis joined the Church of England, though he preferred a simple faith over denominational debates. In fact, Mere Christianity highlights this in major ways. He did not like the divisions found within Christianity and often found himself in his goal to describe mere Christianity. In fact, that's why the title of the book. His belief deepened over time, shaping his career as a Christian apologist with works like Mere Christianity and obviously The Problem of Pain, where he grappled with suffering, once the barrier to his faith, now a mystery found within it. Now, I always loved all of that, and I hope that gives you a little insights into his conversion story, but I love those little side things. Lewis's later years, and I noted I mentioned him as an avowed bachelor, years were spent teaching, writing, and engaging in correspondence with readers and fellow scholars. Be careful who you correspond with. He formed a close friendship with American writer Joy Davidman Gresham, and the relationship later developed into marriage. Tragically, Joy died of cancer, and Lewis wrote about his grief in a poignant book called A Grief Observed. Now, I should note the story of this one's actually even more fascinating, and since this is our opening week, and maybe this will be your first soiree into the life of C.S. Lewis, I'll give you a little background on her and the rest, because I think it's a fascinating story. Joy Davidman was born in 1915 in New York to a Jewish family, Polish and Ukrainian. She was an American. She was a kind of a precocious and gifted child as a writer. She graduated from Hunter College at 19 and earned a master's degree from Columbia at 21. She was a poet, writer, and critic, initially drawn to communism in the 1930s, which shaped her early work, including her poetry collection called Letter to a Comrade. Her first marriage was to William Bill Lindsay Gresham, a fellow writer, in 1942. They had two sons, David and Douglas, but their marriage was troubled by Bill's alcoholism, infidelity, and emotional instability. Clive Staples Lewis, as C.S., as we know him, he was born a little bit later, but he had lived the life of a bachelor, a little bit earlier, lived the life of a bachelor sharing a home with his brother Warney called the Kilns. And also the elderly Mrs. Janie Moore, who was the mother of his friend who was killed in the war. They had made a promise to each other that if the one passed and the other one lived, that they would take care of each other's family. And so that's what he did until she passed. Joy's kind of path began with spiritual and intellectual awakening. She converted to Christianity in 1948. So remember, this is post-Mere Christianity, post a lot of things, partly influenced by Lewis's writings, which resonated with her own personal crisis. You see, her husband Bill abandoned her during a breakdown in her own search for meaning, and so kind of intrigued by Lewis as clarity and wit, she began corresponding with him in 1950. And their letters blossomed into a deep friendship, and this is a key thing. It was a friendship with Joy because she was very sharp-minded and very outspoken, and Lewis, for him, this was very odd because he was a very reserved and kind of, there's a terminology in the British called Donish, like a Don. He was very kind of scholarly, and he liked her brash style. And so they corresponded. By 1952, Joy traveled to England, leaving her sons with relatives at the time, partly to escape the crumbling marriage, and partly to meet Lewis. They met in Oxford, and their bond grew over shared meals and walks. But again, all of this was very platonic. She returned to England permanently in 1953 with her sons after divorcing Bill, who had begun an affair with her cousin. Setting up in London, Joy continued the friendship with Lewis after visiting with him at his home in the Kilns. She continued as an author, and their relationship took kind of an unexpected turn in 1956. Joy was an American divorcee, and suddenly she forced, and this is kind of the sign of our times even here today, forced deportation from the UK when her visa expired. Lewis, kind of ever practical and very loyal, agreed to a civil marriage on April 23rd, 1956, to secure her British citizenship. It was intended as a formality. Lewis assured friends it was platonic, and Joy moved to Oxford with her sons, yet their connection deepened beyond convenience. It really was to keep her in the country. In fact, they lived separately. The turning point came a year later when Joy was diagnosed with bone cancer. Kind of confronted really with her mortality for the first time, Lewis recognized his love for her transcended their friendship. And on March 21st, 1957, they married again, this time in a Christian ceremony at her hospital bedside, officiated by a friend, Peter Bide, who prayed for her healing. Now, miraculously, Joy's cancer kind of went into remission and granting them 3 precious years together. They lived as a family at the Kilns, traveling to Ireland and Greece and a few other places, and Lewis embraced her sons as his own. Joy inspired Lewis's work, notably Till We Have Faces, which he dedicated to her right after this. Their happiness, sadly, was short-lived. Joy's cancer returned, and she died on July 13th at the age of 45. And Lewis found himself extremely devastated by this, pouring his grief into A Grief Observed, the book, publishing it under a pseudonym originally. He wrote of her, "She was my daughter and my mother, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign." Lewis himself died just 3 years later on November 22nd, 1963. Now, it's an unusual story in and of itself, and he promised to take care of the boys, and he has. In fact, both of the boys, I've met one of the sons. He lives on the Isle of Malta, or at least he did when I met him later on. Even though they are not his sons, his physical sons, they are his sons. C.S. Lewis has no blood relatives from that standpoint. I believe Warney may, but I do not believe C.S. Lewis does. Only those that he adopted through this marriage. So, that's kind of the background on this. And also, just as a quick note, does anybody note anything in particular about November 22nd, 1963, like what may have happened at that time? Anybody know what happened? Because his death should have been a fairly significant situation, except for something other notably happened at that moment. And I'll go ahead and give it away to you, but go ahead and put it in the comments. If you get in here before this moment on the recording, you'll know you have got it right. He died on the same day as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so it was a really big deal at the time that this way it played itself out, that he died on that same day. And so his day of death almost went, like people missed it. They didn't see it. It wasn't on the front page like JFK would have been. It would have been otherwise, but it wasn't, and it didn't make itself in. So, God in the Dock, the first letter is what we're going to look at tonight in this. And I want to start off by noting the article itself, because God in the Dock is a compilation of individual essays and writings, responses, newspaper articles, and the rest that Lewis wrote that were then compiled after his death and put together by his editor. This was in, I believe, 1970 was when this was first published. It has a different title in the UK than it does here, but it's most famously known as God in the Dock. And so this first article is in response to an article. So I felt it would be important, especially if this is your first time diving into this notion of C.S. Lewis and his writings, to understand really what he's responding to. So the article, God and Evil by C.E.M. Joad, to which C.S. Lewis responds in the first essay of God in the Dock, titled Evil and God, was originally published on January 31st, 1941. Lewis's response followed in the same publication on February 7th, 1941. So this is a fascinating thing with this back and forth that would be done. It's a little bit like what social media would do today. Somebody would post something on social media. Now, they probably wouldn't wait a week to respond, but there would be a response. So Lewis read the article and then sent in a response to the article that was being set forth, the arguments that were being set forth. Really no different than modern day social media, just a little bit more delayed. And I'll be honest with you, I kind of wish we had more time in the delay. Sometimes people will write things and I'll write things and people will respond very quickly to it. And I often wonder if they've spent enough time thinking about it, truly, or if they found themselves only responding. And so I think because we're in a fast food drive-through mentality of life, we don't actually think through a lot of our responses most of the time, and that's problematic. But he responded to them in writing and the rest, and that was kind of where this started off. Joad's God and Evil, as published in The Spectator, kind of explores the problem of evil in the context of philosophical and theological debates about the nature of the universe. At the time, Joad was a prominent philosopher and the head of philosophy department at the University of London, known for his rationalist and initially agnostic leanings, though he later returned to Christianity, which I often find humorous. In this article, he kind of grapples with the apparent contradiction between the existence of evil and the traditional monotheistic conception of good, omnipotent God. The piece reflects the urgency of this issue amidst the backdrop of World War II. Notice January 31st, 1941, February 7th, 1941. The war, World War II, is at its peak. In fact, not only at its peak, it's at a point of the bombings and the daily things. There is evil everywhere. There is a lot of issues that are going on. There is pain and suffering and is at all-time highs. At least that's how it would be viewed or felt in this scenario. So Joad begins by noting that the debate over purpose and design in the universe is an old one, but he argues that it has renewed relevance due to contemporary experiences of evil, particularly the war's atrocities. So he's noting the war is making evil very evident to everyone. He describes how he and many of his generation were raised as agnostics, rejecting notions like original sin or innate evil. Instead, they attribute evil to external circumstances. They would say, well, it's economic conditions like poverty or psychological factors like repression influenced by thinkers such as Shaw and Freud. And don't think that this isn't still what happens today. There's a lot of evil that happens in our world that we have found ways of justifying. And we justify it by saying, well, this person never had a chance, or this person didn't. We don't know what their situation is. In fact, we make those arguments, the same ones that Shaw and Freud made a long time ago. However, Joad suggests that these explanations no longer suffice given the scale and nature of evil observed in the modern world. So then, in his article, and I'm covering this because it's important because you wouldn't have read this. He then critiques two prevailing naturalistic philosophies: mechanism, the idea that the universe operates like a machine with no purpose, and emergent evolution, the notion that complexity and purpose arise spontaneously from natural processes. Joad rejects both. So do I, by the way, arguing that mechanism fails because it cannot account for the reliability of human thought. If thought is merely an unintended byproduct of physical processes, why trust it? Similarly, he dismisses emergent evolution, suggesting that defining God as whatever the universe does next implies an unwarranted optimism about progress, which in reality of evil undermines. So progress, and I'm going to get through some descriptions here in a second, so I'm just giving you background context right now. This rejection leads Joad to a crossroads. In his article, if naturalistic explanations fail, one must choose between monotheism, like Christianity with a single good God, or dualism, like Zoroastrianism, positing two equal opposing powers, one good, one evil. Joad leans towards dualism as a potential explanation, arguing that the new urgency of evil, exemplified by the war, supports the idea of two antagonistic forces rather than a single benevolent deity allowing such suffering. So basically, he had a problem with the idea that there was a good God who could allow such things to happen. None of this is new. In fact, even in those days and in our days, we still deal with these arguments all the time. He implies that the sheer presence and persistence of evil might suggest a cosmic struggle between good and evil powers of equal standing, rather than a universe wholly under the control of a good God. And this is where Lewis is going to disagree. Lewis, in his response, directly engages with Joad's argument, agreeing with the rejection of mechanism and emergent evolution, but challenging the turn to dualism. Lewis contends that evil's urgency isn't new. Historical figures like Boethius and Augustine face similar horrors, and that dualism falters because evil is not an independent force, but a corruption of good, making it derivative rather than equal to goodness. We'll get into more of these here in a second. So, some terminology. I know because I just read that and some of you might be going, I didn't understand half of that, and I understand this. And it's one of those things that I always feel like I need to help because I need the help too at times. Lewis is from Northern Ireland. He's what we would consider British. At the time, he would be not just British, but even Northern Irish and the rest, or from Ireland at the time. But even the terminologies he uses are dated, not because they are out of date or hold no meaning. They do, but because they are terminologies we might not use today. or they're terminologies that are far more academic than most of us use in our daily lives. So if some of these words are words you don't understand or don't know off the top of your head, welcome to academia. Welcome to kind of the deep end of the pool in these things. But one of the things I love about this is that you can find these things out. We can learn these things. And there are so many great lessons for us to learn. And so with that in mind, I want to give you some terminologies that I hopefully will help you as we walk through the rest of this little piece here. So mechanism. Jode's use. Jode refers to mechanism as a naturalistic philosophy that views the universe as a giant machine, thus kind of mechanism, operating according to fixed physical laws without purpose, design, or intrinsic meaning. In this view, everything, including human thought and morality, is a byproduct of material processes, atoms colliding, chemicals, reactions. He critiques it by arguing that if thought is just an accidental result of these processes, there's no reason to trust its reliability, undermining the basis for rational inquiry itself. So basically, mechanism is everything is just happening because it's happening. It's a giant machine that's just running, but it doesn't have original meaning. And Jode kind of gets to the point, he says, if it doesn't have any meaning, we shouldn't kind of really know it doesn't have any meaning. In fact, Lewis will make that argument. Why would our brains tell us it has no meaning if it has no meaning? That makes no sense rationally. So Lewis uses it, agrees with Jode's rejection of mechanism. He often critiques this view elsewhere, called materialism or naturalism is the terminology that Lewis uses in his other works, as self-defeating. In works like Miracles, his book, he argues that if human reasoning is merely a mechanical outcome, it can't claim to discern truth, including the truth of mechanism itself. For both, mechanism fails to account for the existence of evil as anything more than random suffering. So if mechanism is real, there is no justice. There is no goodness. There is no nothing. It's all random. And so while we may feel it's suffering, it's just part of the process. So we can't actually quantify it in any good or bad way. So it falls flat. Dualism. Jode explores dualism as a cosmological alternative to monotheism. So dualism is the idea of two things versus the idea of monotheism, one good God, suggesting the universe might be governed by two equal opposing forces, one good, one evil. So kind of while we don't use the concept of one good God or one bad God, it's that idea, it's that purpose. He sees this as a plausible response to the problem of evil, especially given the scale of suffering in World War II. Dualism posits that evil isn't just an absence or corruption, but an active, independent power, co-eternal with good. So this is an interesting notion of dualism, as if there was an actual battle over good and evil. And it's at this point that I would just note from a scriptural perspective, if you look just at the Bible, dualism falls flat instantly. Demons don't have any power over Jesus. Demons don't have any powers over God. Angels have no power over God. In fact, even Satan has to ask permission. So the very premise of, even this idea that's often portrayed of Armageddon or the end of the world, this cosmic battle, the reality is there is no cosmic battle in the end. When Jesus comes back, when we see when we see his return in Revelation, the way that it says and prophesies will happen, Jesus comes back and says, it is finished and it's done. There is no battle. There is no war. It's over. And dualism offers, in essence, almost like there's two powers that are equal, co-equal, both good and one bad, and they're dueling it out, fighting it out, and that's highly problematic. In fact, Lewis rejects Jode's dualism, arguing that evil isn't a standalone entity, but a parasite on good. He draws from Christian theology, influenced by Augustine, to assert that evil depends on good for its existence. A lie needs truth to distort. For Lewis, dualism overestimates evil's status and undermines the coherence of a single omnipotent God. Now, emergent evolution, he'll get into this a little bit, but not too much. Jode describes emergent evolution as a naturalistic theory where complexity, life, and even purpose emerge spontaneously from simpler material process over time. So think almost like evolution, this type of concept. Jode critiques this as overly optimistic, arguing that defining God as whatever emerges can't really explain persistent evil. So none of these other theories, in essence, are dealing with pain and suffering and evil, and that's a problem for him. Lewis also dismisses emergent evolution, aligning with Jode's skepticism, sees it as a weak compromise between mechanism and theism, lacking evidence that random processes produce purposeful outcomes. He'd argue it dodges the evil problem by hoping for future improvement without grounding it in any way. Now, here's two terms that are fascinating that because, like you, I guarantee you most of us have not studied a lot of Zoroastrianism. Jodes references Ormuds as the good deity in Zoroastrianism, its dualism, likely to illustrate his point about two opposing cosmic powers. Ormuds is the wise, benevolent creator god in Zoroastrianism, eternally opposed by an evil force. Jode uses this to suggest dualism as a framework where evil, which is Ahriman, has real power, not just permission from a good God. You can think the beginning of the book of Job there. Lewis doesn't directly mention Ormuds, but he explicitly counters Jode's dualistic example by arguing that evil lacks the independent stature of good. He'd see Ormuds and Ahriman as a flawed model because it elevates evil to equality with good, which he theologically rejects. Now, paired with Ormuds, Ahriman is the evil counterpart in Zoroastrianism dualism, the destructive spirit opposing creation and goodness. Jode invokes Ahriman to argue that evil might be an autonomous force, not subordinate to a single living will or single divine will, making dualism a serious contender against monotheism's struggle with theodicy, justifying God amongst evil. Like Ormuds, Lewis doesn't name Ahriman in the essay, but refutes the idea behind it. He'd argue that Ahriman's supposed equality with Ormuds misrepresents evil's nature. Evil, for Lewis, and for a Christian, is a distortion, not a creator, and thus can't stand as an equal rival to God and rival to good. So why do these terms matter? Jode uses mechanism and emergent evolution to reject naturalistic optimism, pushing towards dualism as a live option. Now, Lewis counters by dismantling both naturalism and dualism, defending the monotheistic view where evil is real, but not co-equal with good. The term's density kind of reflects their mid-20th century context, which was war, philosophical upheaval, and a clash between secular and religious worldviews. Now, even here, Zoroastrianism is kind of would have been kind of a newer thing, especially for the British, but not really all that new for British, more so than maybe for Americans. You have to remember the Brits had a long-standing ties to India and to that area of the world, and so they would have definitely known more about Zoroastrianism than scholarly, outside of just the scholars of their day. The everyday person wouldn't have known as much, but the Brits would have at the time. So, God in the Dock, the actual letter that he writes. So that was kind of the backlog. And I know I wanted to give you the kind of the context and the rest before we dive into it, because I think it was important for us to know the terms, know what we're talking about. Maybe it'll help you see just a little bit more as we go through it, what's actually happening. And it'll make it a little bit easier to read as you go through it when you know the terms and know what he's talking about. Dr. Jode's article on God and evil last week suggests the interesting conclusion that since neither mechanism nor emergent evolution will hold water, we must choose in the long run between some monotheistic philosophy, like the Christian, and some such dualism as that of Zoroastrians. I agree with Dr. Jode in rejecting mechanism and emergent evolution. Mechanism, like all materialist systems, breaks down at the problem of knowledge. If thought is the undesigned and irrelevant product of cerebral motions, what reason have we to trust it? As for emergent evolution, if anyone insists on using their word God to mean whatever the universe happens to be going to do next, of course we cannot prevent him. But nobody would in fact so use it unless he had a secret belief that what is coming next will be an improvement. Such a belief, besides being unwarranted, presents peculiar difficulties to an emergent evolutionist, and here's a key point. If things can improve, this means that there must be some absolute standard of good above and outside the cosmic process to which that process can approximate. So if everything must always get better based off of this, is what he's saying, then how can you actually say that there's not something that's defining what is better? There must be something that is defining something better. There is no sense in talking of becoming better if better means simply what we are becoming. It is like congratulating yourself on reaching your destination and defining destination as the place you have reached. He calls it melantolatry, or the worship of the future, is a fuddled religion. And I probably should have defined fuddled. That's one of my favorite words that he uses at times. It is a fuddled religion, this idea that everything in the future must always be better. And it's the worship of progress, as if we've never made mistakes before in life. as if regrets wasn't a real thing, and all thing was always progress was always good. And I would argue that's not always the case. We are left then to choose between monotheism and dualism, between a single good almighty source of being and two equal uncreated antagonistic powers, one good and the other bad. Dr. Joad suggests that the latter view stands to gain from the new urgency of the fact of evil. But what new urgency? Now, this is where I agree completely with Lewis, because Joad makes this idea that evil has suddenly become this new urgency. Now, I wasn't alive in 1941. I honestly doubt I have anybody in the chat that was alive in 1941. If I do, wow, that'd be fantastic. But 1941 was a very different time than what we have here today. Evil was being seen in a way that most of us can't imagine because of World War II. But World War II was not unique from the standpoint of the evils in the world. You go back to the Middle Ages, you go back to the Dark Ages, you go back to the Roman Empire, the Babylonians. There has always been pain and suffering and evil. Since sin entered the world, there has been death, pain, suffering, and evil. And so when he argues from a standpoint of, now that we have this new urgency, we must reevaluate, Lewis asked the right question, but what new urgency? Evil may seem more urgent than it did to the Victorian philosophers, favored members of the happiest class in the happiest country in the world, at the world's happiest period. Now, I think I believe he's saying this in jest. He could also mean because this is like the 1800s, kind of referencing the Victorian 1800s. It wasn't a great time. They didn't have any major wars like the U.S. did with the Civil War and the rest, but it wasn't a great time. And so I think he's being kind of in jest here. But then he notes, but it is no more urgent for us than that of the great majority of monotheists all down the ages. Basically, this idea that pain and suffering is urgent, it's always been urgent, but it's not more urgent now than it's ever been. The classic expositions of the doctrine that the world's miseries are compatible with its creation and guidance by a wholly good being come from Boethius writing in prison to be beaten to death, and from St. Augustine meditating on the sack of Rome. The present state of the world is normal. It was the last century that was the abnormality. So this is where he's kind of looking back and saying the last 100 years where we had it good, 1800s were nice, but they were the abnormality in comparison to history. War and disease and death, this is the norm of the world. And he directly notes even Boethius writing from prison and Augustine writing about the sack of Rome and the death and what happened there too. This drives us to ask why so many generations rejected dualism. So now he kind of turns the favor. Why in the world would he do that? Why would they have rejected dualism all these years if when they also had all these pain and sufferings? Not assuredly because they were unfamiliar with suffering, and not because its obvious prima facie plausibility escaped them. It is more likely that they saw its two fatal difficulties, the one metaphysical and the other moral. So here's where he's going to break these down. The metaphysical and the moral. So these are his main arguments. So I'm going to give you an interpretation of his main arguments. Metaphysical is about the deepest reality. What is everything at its core? When Lewis talks about evil in a metaphysical way, he's asking, is evil a real standalone thing like a rock or a tree with its own power and place in God's creation? Or is it something else? Lewis says it's not its own thing. He leans on a Christian idea, one that goes back to a thinker named Augustine, honestly it goes back to Scripture before, who says evil is like a shadow. That's Augustine's concept. A shadow doesn't exist by itself. It needs light and something to cast it. In God's world, goodness is the light. It's the real thing. The way things were meant to be when God created them, very good. Genesis 1:31. Evil then is what happens when the goodness gets twisted or broken. It's not a rival force God made. It's more like a crack in something beautiful he designed. So metaphysically, evil doesn't have its own life. It's always tied to the good that it distorts. Moral is closer to home for a lot of us. It's about right and wrong, the choices we make, and how we live. When Lewis talks about evil morally, he's looking at how it shows up in our world, in lies, cruelty, or the pain we see around us, like in wars or broken relationships. This is where evil feels so heavy because we experience it every day. It's personal to us. Here's where Lewis connects the dots. Even though evil isn't its own thing metaphysically, it's still real in our lives morally. It's like a stain on a white shirt. It's not the shirt itself, but it ruins the beauty and makes a mess. Evil matters because it's us, or sometimes forces like Satan, taking God's good gifts, love, freedom, and strength, and bending them into something hurtful. Morally, we can't ignore it. It's a call to stand against it and seek what's right. So Lewis, in answering Joad, who wondered if maybe the universe has two powers, like a good God and an evil one, battling it out, Lewis says, no, that's not how it works. If evil were its own power, equal to good, it'd mean God isn't the only creator. But Lewis believes in one God, all good and all powerful, who made everything. Metaphysically, evil's just a shadow. It can't create, it can only spoil. Morally, though, it's a real fight because we're called to resist it and trust God to heal what's broken. So think of it like this. A garden, imagine a garden that God planted. The flowers and trees are the good, his design. Weeds creep in when we misuse our freedom and when sin takes root. The weeds aren't a second garden, they're choking what's already there. Lewis says Joad's dualism gives evil too much credit, like it's a rival gardener. Instead, evil's a problem within God's one creation, a problem he's promised to fix and he has offered the fix. Romans 8:21. For Lewis, this isn't just some brainy stuff, it's hope. If evil's not equal to good, then God's still in charge, even when the world feels dark. Metaphysically, evil's a pretender with no lasting power. Morally, it's our struggle. But we're not alone. God's with us, and he's already won through Jesus. It's like Lewis is saying, keep seeking. Evil's loud, but God's truth is stronger. And I'd also argue it's louder in the end. So, the last few pages of this. Hopefully that description will help you as you see his argument here. The metaphysical difficulty is this. The two powers, the good and the evil, do not explain each other. Neither Ormuzd nor Ahriman can claim to be the ultimate. More ultimate than either of them is the inexplicable fact of their being there together. Neither of them chose this tete-a-tete. Basically saying, where did they come from? And that's one of those things is where did one come? Did one create the other? How could that be? Each of them, therefore, is conditioned, finds himself willy-nilly in a situation. And either that situation itself or some unknown force which produced that situation is the real ultimate. Dualism has not yet reached the ground of being. You cannot accept two conditioned and mutually independent beings as the self-grounded, self-comprehended absolute. The idea of two things being just opposites. And by the way, this plays itself also out in the concept of like the yin and the yang and the balance of the world, good and evil and suffering and pain and sorrow and the rest. This wasn't just unique to Zoroastrianism. On the level of picture thinking, this difficulty is symbolized by our inability to think of Ormuzd or Ahriman without smuggling in the idea of a common space in which they can be together, and thus confessing that we are not yet dealing with the source of the universe, but only with two members contained in it. So basically he's saying, if evil and good were two separate yet powerful things, where are they? And where do they contain themselves? Dualism is truncated metaphysic. The moral difficulty is that dualism gives evil a positive, substantive, self-consistent nature, like that of good. If this were true, if Ahriman existed in its own right no less than Ormuzd, what could we mean by calling Ormuzd good except that we happen to prefer it? In what sense can the one party be said to be right and the other wrong? So this is one of the philosophical arguments he makes. If we say one is good and one is bad, but they're equal, who gets to decide what is good in that? We just given those terms good and bad. But how do we know that? How do we know that not choosing bad is just choosing one of the two options in life? So in that case, he's arguing that dualism, especially in the problem of pain and suffering, who's to say the Nazis are wrong? Because if you think that they're both co-equal, then couldn't one be right and the other one wrong, and we're just wrong about which one's right and which one's wrong? So who gets to decide that? And that's one of the key problems for dualism. If evil has the same kind of reality as good, the same autonomy and completeness, our allegiance to good becomes the arbitrarily chosen loyalty of a partisan. A sound theory of value demands something different. It demands that good should be original and evil a mere perversion. This is where he's going to evil being a shadow. That good should be the tree and evil the ivy. That good should be able to see all around evil, as when sane men understand lunacy, while evil cannot retaliate in kind. That good should be able to exist on its own, while evil requires the good on which it is parasitic in order to continue its parasitic existence. Evil is the betrayal and brokenness. It is the twisting of that which God has made good. That's Lewis's argument. The consequences of neglecting this are serious. Now, this is a key component right here at the end. It means believing that bad men like badness as such, in the same way in which good men like goodness. At first, this denial of any common nature between us and our enemies seems gratifying. We call them fiends and feel that we need not forgive them. They are, and this is, in his case, you have to remember, this is the Germans, this is the fascists, they are the Nazis. This is where you can cast names and think and take away even the agency of the person. They're just bad, evil in and of itself. And you've taken away their humanity, you've taken away everything. In fact, he says, at that point in time, you can't really say anything except for they're just bad. But in reality, along with the power to forgive, we have lost the power to condemn. If a taste for cruelty and a taste for kindness were equally ultimate and basic, by what common standard could the one reprove the other? If they are equals, good and evil, and think about how this plays out in our world today, how can we condemn pedophilia? How could we condemn anything as right or wrong? And now you're starting to see, hopefully a little bit, how this argument, this dualism at times is actually a prevailing philosophy even in our day today in 2025. You see, in reality, cruelty does not come from desiring evil as such, but from perverted sexuality, inordinate resentment, or lawless ambition and avarice. So in this case, it's the very premise of, no, I'm going to do what I want. My truth is my truth. I decide what's right and wrong. I want what I want. It's the age-old jealousy and selfishness and hatred and destruction, and we think we're being original with all this. And in fact, so much of it, get this, is couched in the idea of progress. Now go back to the very premise of emergent evolution, and emergent evolution is tied in directly here with this concept of dualism. You can't tell me I'm wrong. I decide what's right and wrong. People have adopted these types of philosophies that even in 1941, Lewis was going, this is nonsense. That is precisely why it can be judged and condemned from the standpoint of innocent sexuality, righteous anger, and ordinate acquisitiveness. The master can correct a boy's sums because they are blunders in arithmetic, and the same arithmetic which he does and does better. If they were not even attempts at arithmetic, if they were not in the arithmetical world at all, they could not be arithmetical mistakes. Good and evil, then, are not on all fours. Badness is not even bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Ormuds and Ahriman cannot be equals. In the long run, Ormuds must be original and Ahriman derivative. The first hazy idea of devil must, if we begin to think, be analyzed into the more precise ideas of fallen and rebel angel, but only in the long run. Notice he's shifting this kind of the Christian thought process of where does evil come from? And we've taken us, in essence, to the garden, to a fallen angel tempting Eve and so forth. Christianity can go much further with the dualist than Dr. Joad's article seems to suggest. There was never any question of tracing all evil to man. In fact, the New Testament has a good deal more to say about dark superhuman powers than about the fall of Adam. In fact, it talks about our weapons and our war is against spears, are spiritual and against demons and so forth, and things outside of our understanding. As far as this world is concerned, a Christian can share most of the Zoroastrian outlook. We all live between the fell and sense points of Michael and Satan. So he's saying it's not about whether or not, if in essence, he's given this kind of connection between Michael, Archangel Michael, and Satan as if those were the good and the evil, but the problem is he's pointing back and saying, but there is God. So you could make the argument that they are co-equal because they were both angels, one fallen and one not, but Christianity takes it a step further, back to the original concept of God, of goodness. So the difference between the Christian and the dualist is that the Christian thinks one stage further and sees that if Michael is really in the right and Satan really in the wrong, this must mean that they stand in two different relations to somebody or something far further back, to the ultimate ground of reality itself, God. That's what he takes it back to. He said, so even if you want to take just dualism, sure, but only at the angelic realm. Only if you're talking about Satan and Michael or Gabriel. but not it doesn't take it back to the original source, the ultimate ground for reality, which is God. All this, of course, has been watered down in modern times by the theologians who are afraid of mythology, by those who are prepared to reinstate Ormuzd and Ahriman, are presumably not squeamish on the score. Dualism can be a manly creed. In the Norse form, this is his concept of, this is where his literary concepts come out. The giants will beat the gods in the end, but I am on the side of the gods. It is nobler by many degrees than most philosophies for the moment, but it is only a halfway house. Thinking along these lines, you can avoid monotheism and remain a dualist only by refusing to follow your thoughts home. To revive dualism would be a real step backwards and a bad omen, though not the worst possible, for civilization. So he closes out this entire thing by basically saying, you're on to something, but you need to take the next step. Follow it all the way home. There is good and evil, but good and evil is not the end point. It goes back to a good and loving God. And it is man who has chosen good or evil. And the fact that we have all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that God made a way home through his son Jesus. And with that in mind, there is a good and loving God who redeems and offers meaning through pain and suffering. That's what Lewis will get at other times. So, that's the first night. It's a lot on the first night. In fact, next week we'll dive in, and that's one of the things I love about this book, and hopefully you'll have seen it along the way, that it will, every week is a little bit different. Next week we'll dive into the concept of miracles and a discussion on miracles, which I think will be fascinating. So thank you so much for coming and joining us on this evening. If you're watching after the fact, please still let me know where you're tuning in from, where you're coming. Add your comments along the way. Love to know your thoughts and ideas on these different things. I am so grateful, as always, for your attendance. I look forward to seeing you next week. Next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Central. I'll put in the group and also on Facebook and then on YouTube too what we're doing next week, but it should just be a continuation. So letter number 2 from Inside God in the Dock. Until next time, I hope you have a fantastic, fantastic week.